My father walked out of that lawyer's office, absolutely furious. My brother was practically yelling. My sister was already on her phone, probably calling everyone she knew to spread the story. And me? I was holding the keys to a cottage I didn't know my mother owned, reading letters in her handwriting that revealed a whole life they never knew about. But here's the thing everyone wants to know. How did a woman who spent 37 years being completely sidelined by her own family end up with the power to change everything after she was dead? How did the person they all treated as invisible become the person who held all the cards? That's what I want to tell you about. Because this isn't just a story about a will reading. This is a story about what happens when someone you've underestimated their entire life decides to stop being invisible. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and you can already tell it's going to be a disaster? The air gets thick. People exchange looks. And you just know someone's about to make your life hell. That's exactly what I felt when my mother's lawyer called me 3 weeks after the funeral. I wasn't even surprised. I'd spent 37 years getting used to being blindsided by my family, so one more punch didn't seem like it would break anything that hadn't already been shattered. The lawyer's voice on the phone was professionally neutral, but there was something in the way he said family gathering that made my stomach turn. I'd learned to read those micro-expressions, those careful pauses that people use when they're about to deliver bad news wrapped up in legal terminology. My mother had been gone for exactly 21 days when we all assembled in that mahogany-paneled office in downtown Charlotte. The room smelled like old money and older resentments. My brother was already there, of course, positioned in the leather chair closest to the lawyer's desk like he owned the place. He always did that. Even as kids, he'd position himself as if the world naturally bent around him. My sister pulled out her phone before even sitting down, making a point of how little this meant to her, how busy she was. And then there was my father, looking exactly like he did at the funeral, untouched by grief, perfectly put together, as if decades of emotional distance had finally paid dividends. He didn't even look at me when I entered. I took a seat in the back, near the door. I'd learned that escape routes matter. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming," he began, and immediately I knew. The phrasing was too careful. In my experience, when lawyers thank you for coming, it's because someone's about to be devastated. He explained that my mother had updated her will 6 months before she passed. 6 months. That was right around the time she'd started chemotherapy. Right around when she'd finally admitted to me over coffee that things with my father had deteriorated beyond recognition. She'd confided in me about the years of financial abuse, the way he'd controlled everything, isolated her, made her feel small. I was the only one she told. I was the only one who listened. But listening, I was about to discover, didn't matter. Not in the eyes of people like my brother and father. The lawyer began reading, and my brother immediately perked up like a dog at feeding time. My sister actually put the phone down. The bulk of the estate, the lawyer explained, would be divided among them. The house went to my brother. The investments went to my father, along with a note in my mother's handwriting that made my father's face go absolutely pale. He reached for it, but the lawyer didn't hand it over yet. There was a pause. A deliberate, orchestrated pause. And then the lawyer looked directly at me. "Your mother," he said slowly, "left specific instructions regarding the remainder of her estate, along with several documents and letters meant for you." I felt my breath catch. I could feel my brother's eyes on me like laser beams. I could feel my father's entire body go rigid. "She left you," the lawyer continued, "the bulk of her personal papers, her journals dating back 40 years, correspondence with her attorney regarding the nature of certain financial arrangements. And," he turned to face me directly, "she left you the cottage in the mountains that your father didn't know existed." Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. My father stood up so fast his chair fell backward. "That's not possible," he snapped. "She didn't own property. I would have known." "Perhaps," the lawyer said, his voice not changing a single decibel. "You would have, if your wife had been able to discuss her finances with you openly. But according to these documents, your wife purchased this property in 1998 under her maiden name, maintained it through a trust, and paid all expenses through a separate account that you were unaware of." My brother's face had gone a shade of red I'd never seen before. "What? That's ridiculous," This has to be some kind of mistake. She wasn't. Mom wasn't smart enough to do something like that. That's when I almost laughed. Almost. Because that's what they all believed. That my mother was simple. That she was just there, a supporting character in the story of their lives. They never asked her opinion. Never included her in decisions. Never once considered that she might be planning something, thinking something, knowing something they didn't. My father was pacing now, demanding to see the documents, threatening to contest the will. The lawyer, with the calm of someone who had clearly handled worse situations, explained that my mother had anticipated legal challenges and had documented everything extensively. She'd had professional appraisals. She'd maintained records. She'd essentially built an airtight case for her own autonomy before my father even knew there was a case to be made. I felt something shift inside me in that moment. Not triumph, exactly. Something more complicated. My mother had spent decades feeling small, feeling controlled, feeling like she didn't matter. And in her final months, knowing the end was coming, she'd decided to matter in a way that couldn't be ignored. She'd left me something bigger than property or money. She'd left me proof. Proof that she'd had an entire inner life they didn't know about. That she'd been planning, protecting, preparing. That she was smarter and stronger than any of them had ever given her credit for. The lawyer handed me the letters, and I could see my mother's handwriting getting shakier toward the end, but still determined. Still hers. My father demanded to know what was in them, demanded to know what lies she'd supposedly been collecting. But I said nothing. I just held them. And then, with a voice I didn't even recognize as my own, I stood up and said something I'd wanted to say my entire life. I think we're done here. My brother started to protest, but I was already walking toward the door. The lawyer had already given me the keys. The cottage was mine. The journals were mine. The letters were mine. All of it was mine. And more than that, it was real. It was proof. It was evidence that my mother had been a complete person, with her own thoughts, her own plans, her own inner world. That she'd loved me enough to ensure I'd find that out. That night, I drove to the mountains. The cottage was small but beautiful, perched on a ridge that overlooked 3 valleys. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her reading chair by the window, her books on the shelves, and in the desk drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, and addressed to me, more letters than I could count. I spent that night reading my mother's words. 30 years of her life, poured onto pages. Her dreams, her frustrations, her quiet observations about all of us. Her love for me, expressed over and over in ways she'd never been able to say out loud, because someone was always listening, always monitoring, always there. She'd been planning this for 2 decades. Not out of spite, but out of love, out of a desire to ensure that when she was gone, someone would know who she really was. Someone would remember that she mattered. I think that's what people often misunderstand about situations like this. It's not really about the money or the property. It's about visibility. It's about being seen. My mother spent her whole life invisible, and in the end, she made herself impossible to ignore. My father tried to contest the will, of course. My brother hired a lawyer. My sister called me once, trying to figure out if there was anything valuable enough to fight for. But my mother had covered every angle. She had everything documented. She had proof. And more than that, she had me. I hired an estate attorney. And I went through every document, every record, every piece of evidence my mother had so carefully preserved. And I found things. Financial irregularities. Years of my father's mismanagement of her accounts. Instances where he'd taken money without permission. Opportunities he'd promised her that he'd deliberately sabotaged. A whole lifetime of small cruelties hidden under the veneer of a normal marriage. I could have fought. I could have pursued legal action. But I realized that wasn't the point. My mother hadn't done this to get revenge. She'd done it to free me. To give me options. To make sure I knew I didn't have to stay in that family system if I didn't want to. So I didn't. I kept the cottage. I read my mother's words until I could almost hear her voice saying them. And I started building a life that was entirely mine. not defined by my family's expectations, not limited by their assumptions about who I should be or what I should do, just mine. The will reading that was supposed to be my humiliation turned out to be my liberation. My mother's final gift wasn't the cottage or the money, though those mattered too. It was the message underneath it all. You are seen. You are enough. You deserve to take up space in this world. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is refuse to be invisible anymore. I had spent my whole life trying to earn my place at that table, trying to be good enough, quiet enough, small enough to deserve a seat. In the end, my mother's gift was permission to leave the table entirely and build my own. She'd been humiliated by my father's control for decades. She'd been sidelined by my brother's arrogance and my sister's ambition. But in the end, her quiet strength became the thing that changed everything. That's the thing about underestimating people. Eventually, they surprise you. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough to be loved by someone with that kind of quiet strength, their surprise becomes your salvation.